Hey folks, David Ross here. In this video I'm going to be discussing the Winter Storm guitar pedal, some backstory around it, as well as some recent updates to it, which I'm calling version 1.1. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. Now, as some of you may know, I released the Winter Storm guitar pedal as my first release back in March of 2022. I've been building and designing guitar pedals for about 6 years or so, and the Winter Storm was really a culmination of a lot of the circuits I had been working on to that point. I wanted to combine what I had learned into something that would work well on its own or in conjunction with other guitar pedals. And also I wanted to create something that could add as much or as little tonal variation to the sound as you like. The idea being that if you like the sound of your guitar through your amplifier, but just want more or less volume, distortion, treble, or bass, you can do that with the Winter Storm. So in a nutshell, that's basically how it came to be. So as I said, in March of 2022, I released the Winter Storm guitar pedal, did marketing for it, sold them, and eventually moved on to my second guitar pedal release, the Spellbook, which was completed about a year later. Over time, I had begun to hear back from people who had purchased the Winter Storm and had been using the production model about as long as I had. And while the response was quite positive overall, there were a few suggestions that users felt would improve the pedal, and these were things that I noticed myself after spending time with the initial production model. So what I decided to do recently was to take another look at the circuit for the Winter Storm and see if I could address some of these suggestions that I had received. Basically, what I wanted to do based on the feedback I had received, as well as my own thoughts, was to increase the overall headroom and improve the depth control, or the bass control, if you will. After having worked on the Spellbook guitar pedal and going through the full production of that, as well as designing prototypes for a couple of future guitar pedal releases, I'd become aware of some ways to do things which I wasn't aware of when I first released the Winter Storm. I also noticed after looking at the circuit for the Winter Storm that there were a couple of ways that I could make some slight improvements. So what I began doing was redesigning Winter Storm version 1.0 and creating Winter Storm version 1.1, which is what's currently available and will be for the foreseeable future. Now, one thing I wanted to keep in mind was that I didn't want to make any big changes to the overall sound, and this is for a couple of reasons. Mainly because I'm quite pleased with how the Winter Storm sounds and functions, and also I didn't want people who own the version 1.0 to feel like they're missing out on anything. So if you own version 1.0, there's really no need to upgrade. Particularly because my goal here was to have the versions be practically identical, but with some minor improvements, which I'll share with you now. So this diagram shows the output stage for the Winter Storm version 1.0. Essentially what's going on here is the signal is coming into this op-amp, which adds a bit of makeup gain which was lost in the previous section because of the passive tone stack that the Winter Storm uses. Then there's a large DC blocking capacitor, a resistor, and finally a volume control. So this is a very common configuration and something you would see on the vast majority of commercial drive pedals. In version 1.1 I decided to do something a bit different. It still has the makeup gain stage, but I added another gain stage right after it, and used a dual potentiometer, with one half of it being used as a traditional volume control, and the other half of it being used as a gain control. Setting it up like this still allows you to use it as a standard volume, but it also gives you more overall gain and clean headroom from the midpoint and beyond. It's now essentially a dual-purpose control with an increase in gain by about 1.5 times. This is something that was desired particularly in the distortion mode of the Winter Storm, but it benefits all channels equally. The second thing I sought to address was the bass control. When I designed the Winter Storm, I wanted it to be somewhat of a companion to a Fender-style amplifier, meaning it has a volume control, a gain control, and a bass and treble control that you can find on a traditional Fender tube amp. I also wanted to make sure I wasn't dramatically changing the frequency response when the bass and treble controls are at noon and the response is flats. All that was really involved for enhancing the bass response was working in an electronic circuit simulation software program and playing with the values of one of the capacitors that was directly responsible for bass content. Going back and forth, I realized that changing the size of a capacitor by a small amount allowed me to extend the bass response while also retaining the overall function of the tone stack. This ended up not being a very dramatic difference from version 1.0 to version 1.1, but I did feel that it was a slight improvement and one worth doing. One other thing that I noticed with version 1.0 was how I used integrated circuits. In version 1.0 I had used both a TL071 and a TL074, and this gave me 5 op-amps. What I decided to do for version 1.1 was instead use 3 TL072s, which allowed me to use the extra op-amp as a gain stage, which I discussed earlier, and it also allowed me to consolidate the chipsets when ordering PCBs. Essentially, I would save a little bit of money by having one type of chipset as opposed to two, and also due to the way that they're designed, they're practically identical and interchangeable. The main difference between the two of them is the size and number of op amps available in each package. This also leads me into my next topic. Because I decided to consolidate the integrated circuits to use just TLO72s, I felt this necessitated a rearrangement of the components on the printed circuit board. Since releasing the Winter Storm, I had improved on my PCB layout skills, and I was able to make some small improvements to the overall design in version 1.1. I was able to shorten the signal path and reduce track length, and overall I was able to remove about 6 inches of track length from the circuit, or about the size of a patch cable. This serves to reduce the loss of high end throughout the signal and makes version 1.1 a bit of a tighter design. My feeling here is that anything to help retain the clarity of signal is worth doing. So that's pretty much the improvements that I made between versions 1.0 and versions 1.1. And the last thing I want to talk about doesn't really have to do with the function of the pedal, but it has to do with marketing. So as I mentioned previously, I released the Winter Storm version 1.0 in March of 2022. And since that time, I also released the Spellbook guitar pedal and really gave it a big push in terms of marketing. You can see examples of this on my YouTube channel, where I have only a few Winter Storm videos and I have about 20 Spellbook videos. The reason for this is because the Winter Storm was my first guitar pedal release, and also the first product I've ever released in general, and I really didn't know how to market it appropriately. I was very much a beginner with things like videography and photography, and I was essentially learning as I went. Since that time, I've gained a lot of insights, particularly with the Spellbook guitar release having a full Kickstarter and a bunch of content on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And so what I'm going to be doing in the near future is giving the Winter Storm a bit more of a marketing push. My plan is to create a bunch of new videos around it and show off what it can do and how it sounds. At the same time, I'm going to try and improve the overall quality of my content, and I'm hoping that the videos you see from me from now on are going to reflect that. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you'll check out the Winter Storm in my web store on davidrossmusicalinstruments.com. I'll leave a link to where you can find it, and I'll see you next time. Take care.